That also means you're going to get more than your money's worth. I can guarantee you that. So, grab a drink from Jordan at the bar while it's still open. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your vacation. You're in good hands. I've been a Chicago tour guide for over 8 years now. Started out with the tours of the city by hopping up your bus, then I moved over to Segway tours, then bike tours, now finally boat tours. And I got good news for you guys. Of all the ways I've seen this city, this one's my favorite. I'm also not just saying that because my bosses are still within earshot. In fact, the first time I visited this city over 13 years ago, took a boat tour just like this one, fell in love with Chicago, knew I was going to call it home one day. Now again, I've been a Chicago tour guide for 8 years or so, and this is my favorite. And again, I'm not just saying that. In fact, the first time I visited this city over 13 years ago, I took a boat tour just like this one. Fell in love with Chicago, knew I was going to call it home one day. Now don't worry, that's a pretty high bar. Don't expect any of you guys to let you know why I and nearly 3 million other people call this place home. We're going to break that question down into 3 different categories today, starting with our beautiful architecture. We're known all throughout the world for our architecture, and it's constantly changing. In fact, Mark Twain once said of Chicago, she's always a novelty. She's never the same city you saw the last time you passed through. Even if you were here a few years ago, the skyline probably looks different. It changes that quick, always has. So we're going to break down some of these buildings that naturally catch your eye along the river today, talk about the architecture that makes them so special, and also break down several styles of architecture throughout history too. Secondly, Chicago itself, very rich history. All sorts of characters and events throughout our past that have shaped us into who we are today. I'm going to do my 20% of the world's liquid freshwater in the Great Lakes system, right in our backyard. Very convenient connection to the Midwest, East Coast, even Canada. And the Chicago River eventually connects all the way down to the Mississippi River, and after that, the Gulf of Mexico. So this was the spot to meet up a new trade back in the day. That's how we first got our start. Our first official settler was Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. He was a French Haitian man of African descent, set up shop where the Apple store is now, grasslands and marshes. Although it is worth mentioning, when du Sable got here, there were already people here. Chicago was home to a plethora of different Native American tribes, including the Council of Three Fires. And there's an alliance between the Ottawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi tribes. And in fact, even the name Chicago comes from a Potawatomi word. It's 2.7 last I checked. Houston's creeping up on us with 2.4 million, but we still got that third place spot for now. And if you count Chicago land, which includes our suburbs, we've got nearly 10 million people here, which for comparison is more than all 5 New York City boroughs, with 1 million extra people in there too. It spans 3 states and is the 22nd largest metropolitan area in the world. So again, a lot of people call this place home. On the opposite side of DuSable Lakeshore Drive in a moment, you'll see why. Some of the beautiful architecture I mentioned on full display really draws you and makes you want to stay in our city. Go ahead and get your cameras up. It's one of the better shots we get all tour. I'll give you a moment to take this view in, and then we'll start breaking down some of the iconic buildings we can see from this perspective. But first, take a moment and really enjoy this beautiful view right at the mouth of the Chicago River. You guys picked a beautiful day and time for a tour, and this is a great one. Now, first building I want to draw your attention to is coming up on the left. We got a wavy glass building going up in 3 parts. Kind of looks like a lava lamp. This is the St. Regis. It's our 3rd tallest building in the city, but tallest structure in the world by a female architect. Her name is Jeannie Gang of Studio Gang, In 2019, she won the world's most influential architect award. Love to claim it here in Chicago. But when you make super tall buildings like this one, right off the lake, you gotta factor in our lake effect wind. We are the Windy City, get a lot of it, and our taller buildings like this one are literally built to sway in that lake effect wind. We're gonna talk about 3 different methods of sway reduction on the tour today that buildings use to cut back the sway they experience. This one has to use all 3. First one I want to point out is all the way up on the 83rd to 84th floors. If you look up there, you might notice there aren't any floors up there. Those are the blow-through floors. It's a spot specifically designed to have the wind blow through the building. It breaks up and decreases the acceleration of the wind effect on the building. That's a wind diffuser. It's a very significant way to cut back your sway. You just don't see it often because it's expensive. To give you an idea, last year, 71st and 72nd floors of the St. Regis sold for over $20 million. So imagine the loss of real estate when you set aside those 2 floors just to let the wind blow through. You're missing out on tens of millions, but very necessary. In fact, Genie Gang was just going to use 2 other methods of sway reduction we'll talk about later on the tour, until they actually built it and realized even with those 2 methods working together, 50% of people inside would still get nauseous or scared every time a gust of wind came by. That's how much wind we get here in Chicago. So had to leave those floors blank to make sure that more than half the population could even go in. Now, the roof of the St. Regis here is actually 25 feet taller than our second tallest building's roof. It just has a spire on top of it that propels it over that into its 2nd place height. It's right in front of us there, Trump International Hotel and Tower, created by the world's tallest architect, Adrian Smith. He's only 5'7". It's not where he gets the name. Have a shout out to fellow short king. It's because he created the world's tallest building, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. It's the same general design as this, except nearly 2 times the size. Can you imagine 2 of these stacked on top of one another? That's how tall the world's tallest building is. It's truly massive. Also, coming into view on the right is a yellow onion dome on a building, commemorating our name, the Little Stinky Onion. It's on the Intercontinental Hotel. But the interesting thing about that building is in the onion dome. It's the smokestack just beyond it. Back when we built the Intercontinental Hotel in the 1920s, we thought Zeppelin travel would be the way we got around in the future. Giant blimps. So that smokestack was originally a spot where you could park your Zeppelin, enter the hotel, have a valet parker take it elsewhere. Unfortunately, the Hindenburg crash, giant blimp crash happened just a few years after it was built, so it's never going to take off. In fact, there's only 25 blimps in the world right now in total. But that's a very cool moment in history that's preserved in the architecture of the building, which is the theme we'll explore on our tour. What our buildings can tell us about the time periods they come from. And you won't find a blimp dock on buildings nowadays. It's just that old way of thinking that's preserved in the architecture. But again, more on that later, and all throughout. Also, looking ahead, you can see a white building with a clock tower on top, the Wrigley Building. That is built with revivalist style architecture, a popular style from the 1880s to the early 1920s, just following the Great Chicago Fire. Our city's been destroyed. We're starting to rebuild it. I'm going to prove to the rest of the world during that time that we're just as beautiful as any place else. We just don't have our own style of architecture yet to prove that. Europe has a good style though. It's very established and beautiful. So we copy their swag and paste it right here in Chicago. This is based off a cathedral you can still find in Sevilla, Spain. So that's Spanish revivalism to get specific, although that's not the only kind. Pretty much any place you can copy from in Europe has its own revivalism style. In fact, we're about to see a second one in just a moment on the right. It's just beyond the Apple Store in the Fidelity Seller Realty Building. Slowly coming into view is a building that looks like a French cathedral had a baby with an office building. That's the French Gothic revivalist style of the Tribune Tower. Dead giveaway of that style is the flying buttresses at the top, the archways with a gap. And I love a big buttress, I cannot lie. But as beautiful as both of these buildings are, again, they're not Chicago originals. We're just getting them from Europe and we're pasting them here. So they're very beautiful buildings, but they're Europe's beautiful buildings, they're not ours. Fast forward to modern day, architecturally, we do the exact opposite. Up in front of us, once again, our second tallest building, Trump Tower. Now you can notice the 3 terraces or setbacks going up, they actually match the height of the surrounding buildings. So that first terrace matches the height of the Wrigley Building right next door. Same height, mirrors its neighbor. The second terrace matches the Mather Tower, which is the white telescope building across the river there. Third terrace matches the building just beyond it, sticking out the side. It's a giant black box called the AMA building. But it doesn't just match building height, also matches building tone. It's sandwiched between the all-white Wrigley Building, the all-black AMA Building, so this bluish-grayish glass creates a transitional element between the two. Blends all of its surroundings together into a single design, which is why it doesn't work the same if you try and put it anyplace else in Chicago. It's collaborating with its neighbors, which means it only works in this particular site. That's the beauty of contextualist design. Now, if you are like me, by the end of this tour, you actually do want to move to Chicago, I have a recommendation on where you might want to do that. In just a moment, we got one of the more affordable leases downtown. For a studio or one bedroom, the listings inside go for $1,300 to $2,000 a month, which may not sound cheap depending on where you're from in the world, but for downtown Chicago with a river view, I guarantee you won't find a better deal. And you probably recognize these buildings anyway. They're coming up on the right following the bridge, two giant corn cobs, Marina City Towers, iconic apartments from the 60s. And when they were built in the 60s, not a whole lot of other apartment alley, swimming pool, the parking is on the lower levels, the restaurants beneath that, and following the bridge on the right, you can actually see where it gets its name. It's attached to an actual functional marina. You can park your boat there too. You can access all of that from the building without changing out of your pajamas. It's an introvert's dream. You can also get a better view of the parking on the lower levels. Cars have only come out the backside twice. Don't worry, both intentional. One was a Steve McQueen movie called The Hunter. The other was an Allstate commercial. Did that same stunt a few years ago. But it is somebody's job to valet park those. So if you ever feel like your job is stressful, just remember that. It could always be worse. Left-hand side, we got a small concrete building with 5-5 at the top. 5-5 West Wacker. We call it the Danny DeVito building because it's short, stubby in between those supermodels. It is a brutalist building, which doesn't have to do with its brutal boxy appearance like you might think. It's actually the material it's made of. Brutalism comes from the French term béton brut, means raw concrete. And that rough, unfinished exterior is the giveaway, not that brutal design like you might think. Supermodel just beyond it is a sleek glass building. If you draw your eyes up to the top there, you can see what looks like the Parthenon. It's got the traditional pediment, which is that triangle design you'll typically find above Greek and Roman temples. This is a neoclassical design from the 1990s. Again, borrowing a European aesthetic from the past, like revivalism. But nowadays, instead of copying and pasting our design straight up like the Wrigley Building, we make remixes. We take old forms of architecture, improve them with new technology like that glass, see what you get in the modern era when you combine the two. It's like sampling an old song and making a new one out of it. That's what we're doing architecturally now too. Also to the left, eye level, is our Riverwalk. It's a fairly new addition in Chicago. Phase 3 finished in 2016. Cost $112 million. It added spots to grab a bite to eat or drink, an amphitheater. There's spots to go fishing or dip your kayak in. But my favorite addition with the Riverwalk was actually a fish hotel. It sounds weird, but we added a spot where fish can hide from the predators and boats that patrol the waters. And since the 70s, 60 more species of fish have come to the Chicago River. So it's actually doing its job, helping us repair the ecosystem and establish a better relationship to these waterways, which is very important. Because as I mentioned, we owe most of our success and our name to these waterways, but despite that, haven't treated them with respect until much more recently. We've used them for transportation, trade, even sewage at one point in time, so never quite had the relationship with the river we're trying to build now. In fact, one of the biggest concerns I get of people who visit Chicago is about something we do every year, St. Patrick's Day. We dye the river green. You might be aware, we've done this for over 50 years. But you don't have to worry, that's not toxic sludge we're pumping in. It's non-toxic vegetable dye. It's actually bright orange. Just mixes with the already green shade of the river to make it pop and make neon green. Only if that was an issue was the first year we did it. We used 2.5 times the amount of dye we use now, over 100 pounds. Dyed the river green for about 2 weeks. But thankfully, we perfected that amount, and nowadays that dye's gone after about 3 days. So you don't have to worry, that's in good hands too. Another cool style of architecture on the right, what came after revivalism in the mid-1920s. Merchandise Mart, a great example of Art Deco style architecture. It's got this sturdy Indiana limestone as its base material, all about streamlined verticality. Draws your eyes upward, makes the building seem bigger than it actually is. Every Art Deco building is competing for your attention, trying to be the biggest and best in the block. And it draws your attention in with ornamentation. If you look above the windows up there, you might be able to spot some gold diamonds above the windows. That's the glitz and glam of the roaring 20s, coming out in building form. Think Great Gatsby. That's what Art Deco buildings usually tend to embody, the opulence of the 20s. We'll talk a little bit more about the history behind Art Deco and several other styles later, but first, I'm going to get those cameras up again. On the opposite side of Franklin Street Bridge, we get another beautiful trophy piece of architecture, this time at Wolf Point, where the three branches of the river meet. It's another beautiful view. Take it in.
Yeah. Guys can.
All right. Now, first building I want to point out is on the left. We got a curved glass building, the New Vein building. This was Ferris Bueller's dad's office from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. But the curve of that building matches the curve of the river, and so does that greenish bluish tint. So you got pays tribute to what's around it. That's contextualism. There's another contextualist building in front of us, a giant stick of deodorant, a McDonald's apple pie, a Hot Pocket. Take your pick, any one of those. It's River Point with a curved entrance that reflects the curve of the river that they're making here to the right. And the last contextualist building is the one directly in front, a Y-shaped building, 150 North Riverside. Now the Y pays tribute to where we are because Wolf Point, where the three branches of the river meet, actually makes a giant Y if you look at a map of Chicago. This was our first neighborhood. First taverns, hotels, ferries, all cropped up right here where the river meets. So we owe a lot to this particular site and pay tribute to in our designs as well. If you keep an eye out for Y-shaped designs, you can actually find them hidden all throughout Chicago. It's kind of a fun Where's Waldo while you're here. It's all paying tribute to our first neighborhood here, Wolf Point. But as you can imagine, when you make a Y-shaped building, you gotta factor in some structural difficulties with that. So sway becomes a big issue for this building too. What 150 North Riverside does to cut back its sway is called inertial slosh dampers. Inside this building towards the top are 12 massive concrete tanks filled with 160,000 gallons of water. Now, when it gets into the gust of wind, the water in those tanks sloshes the opposite way. So it creates a natural counterbalance to any sway it gets, holds the building in place despite the wind. A very cool, but confusing, modern method of sway reduction. So we'll talk about one more and recap before the end. But this building is also a great example of what contemporary style buildings look like, which is the style of buildings we're making now. It's actually just like your smartphone. Sleek on the outside, jam-packed full of technology on the inside. That's true of modern buildings too. Yeah, we got more technology than ever before. So we can do interesting things, like Y-shaped buildings, or vaulted buildings. Coming up on the left following this next bridge is the Bank of America building. Same problem as 150 North Riverside. Had to keep the Riverwalk free. Back in the day, that meant you missed something on your space. Thanks to technology, that's not true anymore. All you gotta do is vault the third floor of your building with these steel I-beams. If you've ever seen I-beams, they look like this bridge. Not very attractive. So, gotta cover those up with stainless steel, so it looks nice and sleek and futuristic on the outside too. But because of that combination of technology, you can still build all the way to the top of your lot, no structural issues, and look good doing it too. You couldn't do all of that combined until much more recently in architecture. The combined tech wasn't there yet. So this building's a great example of how far technology is pushing architecture to the future, and a great timestamp for where we're at now. Because on this next portion of the tour, we're going back in time, talking about how Chicago's architecture has evolved alongside history. Yet following the fire, we begin rebuilding with revivalism, copying and pasting European designs, like the Wrigley Building. In the mid-1920s, we switch over to Art Deco. Another example on the right, Riverside Plaza. When we're making Art Deco buildings in the roaring 20s, we're looking optimistically to the future, pouring all our money into them to be the biggest and best in the block, because life is great in the 20s. What could possibly go wrong? Give you an idea of what went wrong. Left-hand side, Civic Opera Building. Opened 2 weeks after the stock market crashed in 1929. Only made it for about 3 years before it went bankrupt. So, the Great Depression comes along and cuts short the Art Deco era, and shortly following the Great Depression comes World War II. So there's a big break in building from the 1930s to the 50s. When we come back to building after the war, buildings look a lot different than Art Deco here. Coming up on the right, 2 large black steel boxes. These are modernist buildings from the 1950s. After World War II, there's a big return to the workforce, so we need office buildings quick to accommodate that. Mies van der Rohe takes architecture back to its 3 most basic building blocks of modernism: skeleton, skin, and space. That's all your building needs. Now, the skeleton of these buildings is the steel aluminum frame that hold them up. These are office buildings, so they're all business. They wear their structure and their skeleton right on their sleeve. They're not trying to wow you in the same way that Art Deco buildings do. Their only concern is being an office building. They've done that, they're successful. So they can get back to basics. The skin is the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the space are the plazas that surround each and every one, currently under construction. Now again, these are functional buildings. They get the job done, but they're also quite sterile, not very human. So to humanize them, we keep those plazas as a spot where you can enjoy your lunch, be around nature, feel like a little bit more than just a cog in the machine. That's the psychological effect of space. There's no agenda behind it. It allows room for you to exist as you are, which is necessary if you live in a city or work in a giant black sterile box like this. And also, no matter where you put a modernist building, it sticks out. And so eventually this style slowly softens and becomes a style that belongs anywhere in the world. International style. The head on the right, that gray-white building, that also may look like a building from your own hometown. In the 1970s, that was the international style. It means you could pull it out of most places in the world. They still look very similar. Boxy shapes, plazas, they're your typical office buildings. The biggest cheap buildings after the war at the cost of fitting in, we are now actively trying to fit in with the global scheme of architecture that starts to take off. And if you're not careful, all these different styles of architecture will make your city feel like a random collection of buildings competing for your attention, instead of a more intentional city or neighborhood. You lose sight of the big picture when you only think about your particular building. And so contextualist buildings, like the one ahead, now the curved glass building, they instead are team players. They sacrifice their own personal identity to collaborate instead of compete with their neighbors, which means the shapes of the buildings, stage of glass, or setbacks, all reflect and depend on what's around it. No two contextualist buildings look the same, because no two spots in the city are the same either. They blend all the styles of architecture together and create much more intentional collaborative neighborhoods. Otherwise, your city might just feel like random buildings all thrown together. That's why contextualism is some of my favorite architecture. It's very intentional stuff, really pulls together the big picture of your city. It's also still very alive and well today as an architectural style. Again, Trump Tower is a great example of contemporary contextualism. Say that 10 times fast. But contemporary style architecture isn't just about tech advancements. It's about using that tech to create a remix, like the neoclassical building we saw earlier, or this remix that's coming up on the left. Following the Bridge is a modernist building, added a "You Are Here" map to the side 2014. Following the bridge, you can draw your eyes up, see a red box sticking out. That's where we are on the river. And if you draw your eyes up past that, you can also see the literal Chicago Y of Wolf Point, where the three branches meet. Really does make a wow on a map like that. And another remix is coming up here on the right. Art Deco style building, the Old Main Post Office. In the opening sequence of The Dark Knight, Joker ziplines onto the roof of this building, robs a bank, and drives a bus through the side of it. But we actually used to get our mail there too. Nowadays, that's just offices. Underwent a $900 million renovation a few years ago. With all that money comes a very cool addition. It's 3.5 acres of space called The Meadow. Comes complete with walking trails, basketball and pickleball courts, a bistro bar, all on the roof of that building. It's unfortunately private, which means you gotta work there or go somebody who does to get up there. If you know somebody, come find me. I'm trying to work on my connection. But that does make it a green building. It's LEED certified, which stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It's another big facet of modern architecture. It's not just about playing nice with your neighbors, but also with the environment too. And here in Chicago, we have more LEED certified buildings than any other city in the US. We're quite literally leading America's Green Charge, which you may not be aware of. But that catches up to modern day through an architectural lens. We're gonna go back in time once more through a historical lens. Talk about some of the important characters and events of Chicago's past that were busy during that time, shaping us into who we are today. 1871. It's a Sunday night, 9 p.m., quiet fall night in Chicago, until suddenly, 4 blocks to the right of where we are now, a fire breaks out for an unknown reason at the Old Leary Ranch. Over the next 3 days, 32 hours, this fire slowly spreads, consumes everything we can see on our tour, destroys 3.5 square miles of the downtown area. All but 7 buildings in that radius completely destroyed. It renders a third of our population homeless. It costs an estimated $4 billion in modern day damages. This is the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, largest urban fire in history. Main question on everyone's mind, how'd the fire start? We're looking for a scapegoat. In this case, a scape cow. Mrs. O'Leary's cow takes the blame. Supposedly, she leaves the lamb to the barn with her cow, goes to bed for the night of fire. You may have already heard this one. However, it's not true. It's just a rumor that got out of control. You might say it's a full-blown cowspiracy. No? I had to milk it for a joke or two, you know? That was true. On his deathbed, 1893 admits he completely made that story up. It's just a lie. Still, it's a catchy lie, I'll admit. Keeps getting passed down even after his death. And Mrs. O'Leary wasn't fully exonerated until 1997. Well over 100 years after he admits he lied, long after she's gone. But nowadays we know it wasn't the cow. But if it wasn't the cow, who was it? We actually weren't the only city on fire October 8, 1871. In fact, there was a series of little fires burning all across the Midwest. We know a lot of those fires were caused, believe it or not, because of a meteor shower. Bits of rock falling from space to Earth and catching the ground on fire. Now, since they happened at the same time, we're so close as other places, we figure our fire could have also been a meteor shower incident. But we don't know for sure. That's just our best guess. We'll probably never know for certain what truly caused the Great Chicago Fire. But it's not just a mystery and a travesty, it's also an opportunity. Chicago is now this blank slate just waiting to be rebuilt. The first city burned to the ground. Now the second city can rise from the ashes. That's where we get our nickname from. It's not because we're second to New York like everyone thinks, because the first city burned down. We had to rebuild it. Architects from all over flood here to help us build that second city. The architect leading the charge is Daniel Burnham. He's got a great quote I love. He says, "Make no small plans, for they have no magic to stir men's blood. Instead, make big plans. Aim high and hope and work." That's exactly what he does. He aims high and works hard. And with his help in 22 years following that fire, we're able to rebuild our city big enough to support one of the largest and most influential World's Fairs in American history. It's the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, also spearheaded by Burnham. We hold that to the south in Jackson Park where the Museum of Science and Industry is. And in 6 short months, 27 million people from all around the world come through the turnstiles of that World's Fair. So it puts Chicago back on the map, and also gives us our second nickname. We're in a very contentious battle with our older brother New York about who should hold that World's Fair. New York's winning it first. Then Chicago pulls ahead. Then New York again. Go, you guys. It's an urban city plan that lays the groundwork for Chicago. He calls us the Paris on the Prairie and promises to live up to our motto, Urbs and Orto, which means city in a garden. Fast forward to modern day, there's over 600 public parks in Chicago, 19 miles of lakefront trail, and 24 public beaches. If we feel different than the cities you've been to, even if you can't put your finger on why, a lot of the times that usually comes down to just how much green space we got built in. When you make public parks a priority and have over 600, it really does create a different feel for your city. But the Burnham Plan also lays the foundation for a pier that becomes Navy Pier, a shopping district that becomes a Magnificent Mile, and our Riverwalk, again, whose main branch was completed in 2016, but is still actively being worked on in this area too, which means the Burnham Plan is still shaping Chicago into the future. Fire destroys the city, World's Fair puts it back on the map, and the Burnham Plan lays the foundation for almost everything we've built since and are continuing to build into the future. Those are 3 of our biggest historical events. Now, in just a moment, we're going to make a U-turn here, head back up the South Branch where there's more fun things to see, do, and talk about. In the meantime, that makes this an ideal moment to use the restrooms in the back if you have to, pay Jordan a visit at the bar while it's still open for a drink, or ask me a question. I'll be coming around in just a few moments, make sure you can hear all right. During that time, if you have any questions, anything at all, just say, "Hey Jack," raise your hand, flag me down, be happy to answer whatever questions you might have for me. When we head back up the South Branch in just a moment, we'll talk about some of the cultural things we want to do here. The different observation decks, Chicago-style food options, shows, all that fun stuff. It's my favorite part of the tour. So stay tuned, still a lot more to come. Thank you, not necessary. You still stuck with me for a little bit. Got a fantastic skyline photo for you guys here. So we're going to take a moment so you can snag some skyline photos, really soak that in. And then again, I'll hop back on the mic in a little bit. We'll get them covering that cultural information that I mentioned. But in the meantime, feel free to snag a skyline photo. And if there are any other questions, feel free to ask them to me. And then we'll get moving in here again in just a few minutes. looking a little bit different. Now, the other thing that I want to recommend to you guys is something that I recommend to anybody who visits Chicago. That's to get out and see our neighborhoods. Now, I want to be clear, that's nothing against the downtown area. They've each got their own unique style, taste, and flair. So there's a little bit of something for everybody out there. But the main thing our neighborhoods have is our nightlife. Most people expect Chicago to be like New York, the city doesn't sleep. That's not true at all. Downtown Chicago is the city with a bedtime of about 8 o'clock. If you try and go out tonight after the tour, you're going to see what I mean. It's hard to know what to do. And that's because, while we work downtown, it's a little too expensive to live downtown. For really nightlife suggestions, I have them. So after the tour, I'll be standing someplace I can answer your questions. If you have any, don't hesitate to ask during that time. That's what I'm here for. So I'll be happy to point you the right way. Now, we'll get back to it. And before we get into the cultural meat of this next section, we'll kick it off with some of the buildings we can see here, starting with the one in front. It's a building made of pink Texas granite, lit up circles on top of it there. That's 311 South Wacker, the queen of the skyline. Will always be the Sears here. You gotta embody that Chicago stubbornness. You wanna fit in with the locals here. The reason that we're stubborn, when it was built in 1974, base just the third tallest in the US. But that's unfortunately because those antennae don't count anymore. They have Wi-Fi, radio, cell signals, which nowadays disqualifies them from your Argo. But on our windiest day, Sears Tower can sway up to 18 inches in any direction, a total of 3 feet. So you might feel that building move, especially on the elevator ride up. Keep in mind it's built that way. You don't need to freak out too much. Anyway, if you do head up there, you're over 1,000 feet in the air. You can put mild, sweet, or hot peppers on there. I put mozzarella cheese on mine, so it's nice and melted.